At different times, you've managed and led Britain's two biggest deaf charities. That's the Doug Alker we know. But you've also been a magician and a comedian. You've played football and rugby, and you've also been a coach in both these sports. Now in your 70s, you're back in Lancashire as Executive Chair of East Lancashire Deaf Society. So you've been managing and leading people all your life. Do you think you were a born leader?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. Always a first time. Well, first, a lot of people say that I can be a stubborn person, very stubborn. I don't give up easily. I'm very persistent. And if I need to achieve something, I'll really go for it. But I also believe that things like my life experiences, what's happened to me in my life, these have affected me and shaped me into this kind of driven person that people see. There you go.
You say you can be stubborn and driven. Where do you think you got these qualities from?
Well, as somebody once said, how you develop depends on two factors. First, the personality you're born with, and second, environmental effects. So, there's my personality, which you can't do much about. And then there are the environmental effects. First, I went to boarding school from the age of 3. I spent all my time in school. There was nobody looking after me. I had to look after myself and learn to rely on myself. There was no mummy to run to tell her what had happened. That's bound to have an effect. So I had to become self-reliant. There was no other option. Secondly, my family background was very poor. Very poor. We had nothing. And that has an effect on you too. When I went to grammar school when I was 12, well, before that, everybody at school was the same. We were all poor Lancashire boys. But at Mary Hare, the pupils there, especially the ones from the south, were quite well off, you know, very hoity-toity. So that made me more assertive as well. Then the headmaster there was always taunting me about my background. I remember we were allowed to bring our bikes to school. Everyone else had these nice bikes, smart racer bikes, all different colours. Me? Well, at that time my father worked at Leyland Motors on their production line. So he fixed me up a second-hand bike with straight handlebars, a sort of muddy brown colour. The headmaster made fun of me in front of everybody. Things like that. I think that all added up to make me want to prove myself, to retaliate, to show that people from poorer backgrounds can be as good as anyone else.
Before school and during school, you mentioned your father. What kind of influence did he have in your life? And your mother as well?
My father was never really interested. My mother was the main influence, I think, with me being deaf. My father had very little effect on my life. It was mostly my mother. One thing that I think is quite important, my mother always said, whatever you want to be, you can do it. Never mind what it is. Whatever you want, go for it. In fact, when I was about, I can't remember, maybe 11 or 12, my ambition was to be a surgeon. I had visions of me doing operations, operating and curing people. I was always reading medical books as well as novels. In those days there was an author called George Sava. He wrote medical books. Another was Frank Slaughter. I used to devour both of their books. My mother said, "Why not? Why not?" School's attitude was, "Don't be silly, don't be silly." But I was determined, and my mother encouraged me. Whatever you want to do, you can do it. So that had a very positive effect on me. Later, when I was 16 or so, I realised if I wanted to be a surgeon, I'd have to use a stethoscope. And I was deaf, so I couldn't. So I gave up that idea. Then I thought, right, I'll be a pathologist. But again, I realised that before you can become a pathologist, you have to have a medical degree. Then there was the thing with the stethoscope again. That's why I ended up being a chemist.
After you left school and came back home, you did get involved in the deaf community. But you drifted away after a while. Why was that?
That's right. I disappeared from the deaf world for about 15 years. I got married to a hearing wife. I was working for a company. I was a trade union rep at the firm I worked for. I was also a semi-professional magician, doing the working men's clubs. At the same time, I was going for my football coach qualification. So I had all these things going on. That's why I just had no time for anything else, just that. Family, rugby, football, magic, all that. But during those 15 years, I learned so much more than I would if I hadn't been involved. But what I did learn turned out to be very useful later on, when I came back to the deaf community.
So for 15 years you disappeared. You said you learned all these new skills. Finally you came back to the deaf community. Why was that? And with the new skills and information from your trade union work, what do you think you brought back to the community?
One fellow, he was branch secretary of the British Deaf Association, Richard Godley. He knew from the newspaper about my union activity and all my other work. So he asked me if I'd be interested in representing Blackburn Deaf Club at the Northern Regional Council meeting in Barnsley. So I said, OK, and went along. So we're all there. And I was astonished to see that the committee of the BDA were nearly all hearing. They were very, very manipulative, very patronising, and the deaf were all just sitting there passive. So I put my hand up and said I'd like to see a copy of the Constitution. And Jimmy Hudson just brushed my request aside. So I said, how can I bring a motion to the floor? And I was told to sit down. I was staggered, honestly. This was in front of everybody. I thought, they can't do that. I was raging. So I went back. Well, at that time, a lot of deaf people were quietly agreeing with me, against them. So I went back. I was chair. I was a member of the Blackburn Deaf Club. So I invited a deaf rep from each area, Lancaster, Preston, and so on, to come to a meeting. And they all agreed with me that we should set up the Deaf Tribune group. At that time, we believed, well, I believed, that the chair of the BDA should be deaf. He wasn't deaf. There'd never been a deaf chair. That couldn't be right. So the first step was to elect a deaf chair. So the Tribune group started planning towards that. We were aiming it for the BDA conference in Torquay. That was when, finally, the first deaf chair of the BDA was elected.
Can you tell us more about the big effects your changes had in the BDA?
Well, it first started with deaf people getting more and more control of the BDA board. And eventually, all the members of the BDA board were deaf.
In 1986, you shocked your friends by joining the Royal National Institute for Deaf People. What was your thinking at that time?
I even shocked myself. I was surprised too. I was the same as a lot of deaf people, always very anti-RNID. At that time, the RNID had brought in a new chief executive, Mike Whitlam. They brought him in from somewhere outside, from Save the Children, I think. And he was very visionary, very keen to promote the rights of deaf people, the sign language community, and so on. The way Mike Whitlam was talking, I thought it was worth a try. So I became the director for the South East region, then director for all of the regions. It was a huge opportunity to influence deaf rights and deaf issues in the wider community. And that's my strength. So that's why I decided to make the move.
So you worked your way up the ranks, and in 1994 you became chief executive. How did you feel? And you had all these plans and strategies to change the RNID. But was that just a dream?
Obviously, when I became chief executive, I was really delighted because that was a huge organisation with about 1,000 staff. So it was a massive opportunity to influence and change things. I started a few things that I thought fitted into the vision I wanted to achieve. But in the end, well, I wasn't allowed to achieve it. I was really disappointed because that was a huge opportunity. When will we ever have another chance like that? The door opened and then it was closed. Will it ever open again? It's questionable. We've lost that opportunity.
What do you mean you weren't allowed to carry on? Can you clarify?
Well, it was really the internal politics. Specifically with one or two key people on the RNID board. That's where the power is, on the board. It's the same with any organisation. You can't do anything unless you have a united board which is behind the vision. Once the board splits or the board no longer supports the vision, you're wasting your time.
But then you didn't go back to the BDA. You set up a new organisation, the FDP. Why was that?
You know, I've always been an activist in the deaf community. Every community usually has one or two activists here and there. And usually they're very isolated. They want to move or do something, but they're on their own. That worries me. There were two things that affected me a lot. One was a French deaf activist, Jean-François Mercuriot, a good friend of mine. He killed himself because of the pressure he was under. After he died, the deaf movement in France just fizzled out. Then there was Dot Miles. Same with her. She was isolated and she killed herself. So I set up the Federation of Deaf People so that activists could come together to support each other. That's why we set it up. And from there it just grew and grew. Then they started doing things they thought the BDA should have been doing. I mean, so that's what happened. At one of the FDP conferences, In fact, it was the first conference. One of the speakers was Harlan Lane. His message, a massive message, which unfortunately I don't think people really got. He said that the problem with the deaf community is that we've always argued with each other. We should be looking out there, taking our arguments out there. We spend too much time arguing with each other and getting nowhere.
What do you think the FDP achieved in the end?
Well, first, of course, I think without the FDP, well, I doubt it anyway, I don't think we'd have had BSL recognition. Maybe we would, but I don't think so. The marches the FDP organised were fantastic because every organisation wanted to be involved. That had never happened before. It was a massive achievement. We had, I think on the second march, 9,000 people from all over, all the different organisations.
Then finally you did come back to the BDA as chair. Were you hoping for similar achievements there?
Well, the sign language community is the most politically powerful group of deaf people. Hard of hearing and deafened people are there, but politically they're not powerful. The BDA, the BSL group, is powerful. So I wanted that to become the most powerful organisation for deaf people. But it needed a better structure, a clear vision, and financial stability. So that was what I planned to achieve, and it started off well. But somehow it got lost along the way.
What do you mean it got lost along the way? Can you explain that?
OK, well, I had to, because I believe the BDA should show an example by employing deaf managers. If the BDA can't do this, you can't expect other organisations to do it. So I brought in new people. Some of those managers needed time to develop, but they never got that time. Not enough time, anyway. If they'd got a bit longer, then maybe, but before that happened, the board started to split. Frankly, I think some members of the board were more interested in self-glorification. And once that starts, if people are more interested in their own glory than in what's really happening out there, it's finished.
So you felt you couldn't carry on? That's why you stepped down after just 5 years?
It would have been a waste of time carrying on.
You talk about the board being split, people just interested in themselves. But as a good chair, a strong motivator, why couldn't you have persevered and worked this through with them?
That's a fair point. There's a difference between, say, managing staff who have to do what they're told because they're paid, and a management board who are not paid. There's a difference. One thing I should say, my strength has always been in the vision. Managing people? Well, I'm okay. I depend on good senior managers to do the detailed management. I'm okay. I can think of other people better at that than me. But vision and drive, those are my strengths.
So you stepped down from the BDA. Now your longest spell of work has been back in Lancashire at ELDS. In your first year, the turnover was £40,000. Now it's soared to £2 million. It's overtaken the BDA. Has this vindicated your vision, your strategy? A local organisation, but it compares well with a national one.
With East Lancashire Deaf Society, what we'd been doing there was making decisions, arguing and discussing the issues over many years. So ELDS was an opportunity to actually prove something by doing it. So we have a restaurant, and people come in because they want a meal. Some of the staff are signing. So what? So what? That's what we're doing. And we're growing. And the money comes from business development.
from development.
We get nothing from legacies,
Nothing.
nothing
Legacy.
from donations, nothing.
Do you ever think, looking back on all your work at national level, maybe you should have stayed at home all along?
No, because at that time there were different opportunities to influence and change things nationally. I felt that I had the experience, the background, like I mentioned before, my trade union and other experience, and I felt there was an opportunity to use them to influence national policy. Whether I achieved that, whether I was successful or not, it doesn't matter. It was worth trying.
Looking back over your life, do you have any regrets, any disappointments?
Well, one thing, I never look back. I like to say, once you made a decision you feel was right at the time, move on. Of course, if I look back, I've had different opportunities. I could have had a full-time career as a magician. I could maybe have done more professional football coaching. Maybe. There are hundreds of maybes. But I don't waste time regretting anything. It would have been nice, but at that time, moving on was the right decision. Look back and regret it? No.
So, can you sum up what you feel you've achieved?
I think I've made things happen. And I think I've made a difference to many people's lives.
How?
Nearly everything I've done has been for the benefit of other people. To improve their lives, their skills, their opportunities, everything. That's very satisfying. It's very satisfying to be able to do things that actually improve the lives of other people.
So for 30 years you've worked, you've motivated people, you've been a leader at the top. If and when you decide to retire full-time, what would you like to see out there in the community?
Well, first of all, retire full-time? Impossible. Absolutely impossible. I won't stop. That's why I'll still be here when I'm 100. I think the most fundamental thing that we don't put enough time and effort into is education. That's the starting point. If deaf people were educated properly in the first place, we wouldn't have so many problems now. We do a lot of remedial work afterwards, after they leave school. Remedial work with social workers, remedial work in education, all that stuff. We're getting it wrong right at the beginning.
So, Doug Alker, you're a public person, you're known locally, nationally and internationally. But can you tell us, what do you like as a private person?
Very private.
Yes, but what do you mean private?
OK, I'm involved in all these different things, like I said. But at home, very, very few deaf people ever enter my home. I keep my home life separate. It gives me the chance to relax. My private life has always been, I need that. It's where I recharge my batteries. Also, you can't go on banging your head against a brick wall forever. Sometimes you need to take a break from it. For me, that's my home life.
So all these phases of your work and your public life, has that affected your private life?
Oh, yes. Yes. Definitely. Definitely. I've had 4 marriages. That says everything. It's bound to have an effect. It's difficult to get that balance, to be fair to my wives. There you go.
So does all this focus on public life mean you've neglected your private life?
Guilty.
Now you've contributed, worked, achieved so much, campaigned. How would you like, I know you're a humble man, but how would you like us to remember you?
I don't really care. I've been called a lot of names. But seriously, there was one quote, a long time ago, about 20, 25 years ago, in a newspaper article. It called me a gritty crusader. I think that sounds about right. A gritty crusader. That's good. I'll take that.